Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Robert Litvak, the Center's Vice President for Programs and Director of International Security Studies. I'd like to welcome you to today's meeting, a book discussion of an excellent new book by Bruce Gentleson, who's with us today, and his co-author Stephen Weber Berkeley, who's not. The book is End of Arrogance, America and the Global Competition of Ideas. Copies available for purchase outside the door, and autographing by the author at the conclusion of today's session. Bruce Gentleson is an old friend of this institution and my program in particular. He's a professor of public policy and political science at the Sanford School of Public Policy, Duke University. He's also currently serving as a senior advisor to the U.S. Department of State's policy planning director. Bruce has wide-ranging research institutes, and in terms of the programmatic interests of my program here, we've worked together on U.S. strategy towards a group of states that are designated as rogue states, and that was a previous project. This book is, which we'll hear about today, is sort of his latest thinking on where the United States is, and in terms of this question about where the system is going and the global competition of ideas. It's a broad-ranging work, and it's really the kind of it's not the capstone of his career, because he'll remain productive for, we hope, a very long time. But it's the type of work that really reflects kind of reflection and a synthesis that comes with having addressed the wide-ranging of issues over the period of time he has. So we look forward from hearing from him today. We welcome him back to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Bruce, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Rob. I really appreciate it. And I've also been an admirer of Rob and his work for many, many years, and have enjoyed collaborating and appreciate the invitation. I want to recognize my co-author, Steve Weber, who is professor at UC Berkeley, and can't be here today. We're doing some of these events together, some separately. But I did want to recognize Steve, who's been a great friend and colleague to work with on this and many other things. As Rob said, I'm sort of currently, as we say in Washington, dual-hatted. I continue to be full-time at Duke on the faculty, teaching, writing, various responsibilities as a university professor, and also for about the last year and a half, was appointed at State Department as a senior advisor to the Director of Policy Planning, Anne-Marie Slaughter, many of you know her, and she's a longtime friend and colleague. And so I've been spending about 2 days a week in Washington working on a variety of issues, the Middle East, one of them, but a number of other issues as well. So let me just sort of make a couple caveats up front. One is this book is written with my Duke professor hat on and not in any official capacity. The views are my own and in no way reflect the Obama administration or any other official responsibilities I have. Secondly, in that position, working in the State Department, I deal with many specific and immediate issues. What's in the inbox, what's coming over the cables, what do we do about the Middle East peace process in the next 2 hours? How do we move ahead with NATO, a variety of other things. This is more of sort of a big picture book, and it's a broad sort of worldview, more about sort of guiding concepts more than a laundry list of issues and positions. And I have to say that the more I work in government, the more convinced I am of sort of the big picture importance. It helps shape, it helps frame, it helps guide the way we think of things. We risk so many times being so focused on the trees that we don't get enough sense about the forest. And so we really believe, Steve and I, and Steve does an awful lot of work with the intelligence community, does some consulting with the NIC, as well as in the corporate community, that we really believe that this was an important policy, not just sort of the musings of two professors. And the third caveat is it's really not about the full agenda of American foreign policy, but it's really about what we call the global competition of ideas, and I'll explain what we mean by that. I'm going to keep my remarks very brief, so that we can have some time for questions and discussion. We actually have to leave right at 1 through some scheduling that wasn't very well coordinated on our part. We've scheduled a book event in Chicago with the Chicago Council of Global Affairs tonight, so I've got to catch a plane to go to Chicago. I'm more than happy to have another event, but we just sort of didn't manage our calendar very well. So let me make 3 sets of points. First, what we mean by the global competition of ideas. Secondly, the broader strategic context of this. And third, the strategy for succeeding for the United States in this global competition of ideas. And I'm going to say these in the context, both give you a sense of the context in which we started thinking about the ideas in this book, which really take us back to the post-9/11 world. And then the context in which we're publishing this book. The book came out in the last month in a particular political context in our country, for sure. And I think the two are important, obviously, in their own right. The origin of the book was a sort of a discontent that we had post-9/11 about all this talk about the so-called war of ideas. It just didn't click with us. In fact, if you Google the term war of ideas, you get 64,100,000 entries, including Jane Austen and the war of ideas. What we thought it did get right was that ideas really matter. They always have in history. It's not just been about economic interests or geopolitical interests, and they do especially now. That much of international affairs is about military power and diplomatic statecraft and economic capacity. But ideas are a driving force in a very dynamic global competition that the 9/11 war of ideas formulation missed on two main counts. One was it's not just about freedom versus fundamentalism, as it was often framed, particularly in the immediate post-9/11 world. It's really about much more. It's about the debates around globalization that were already going on. It's about the debates at the end of the Cold War set off, and none of these ended with 9/11. 9/11 added on, but it did not supplant these other forces that were defining our world. In fact, we published an initial version of this as a cover story in Foreign Policy magazine in November '08, which they actually timed intentionally to come out when that election was over, to say now that we've decided the election on a whole set of issues, here's a sense of sort of what the bigger ideas are. And what we argued there, and what we argue in the first chapter of this book, is that the big questions that we thought were settled at the end of the 20th century have been reopened here in the 21st. There's so many of our prevalent formulations that we've worked with in this country, from the end of history to the democratic peace, to globalization as Americanization, to the clash of civilizations, then the Bush-era sense of the United States as the new Rome. Whatever else there are differences among these, they all had sort of a great continuity between what worked in the 20th century carrying over to the 21st. And the way we look at it is a lot of the really big questions have been reopened here. Let me just give you a couple examples. One, of course, is who makes the rules internationally. We have rising powers, of course, and there's been a lot of talk about integrating the rising powers. But what's emerging in the 21st century is not a version of 19th century multipolarity where we sort of have around the table not just the countries that are in the 20th, but Brazil and India and maybe Indonesia or Turkey. In those days in the 19th century, however many countries you had around the table, they basically controlled the world, and therefore whatever decisions they could make would stick. But we live in a very vibrant international era of 192 countries pressing their interests and identity, not all with the same amount of power. And in a world in which it's not just a question of who's going to be the next hegemon, or can you be a benign hegemon, but as we argue that we think hegemony is simply impossible, that the question of who makes the rules is being disputed in any number of arenas, from currency values to the use of force, to trade practices, to the climate change, etc. It's a big open question, much more so than we thought in sort of those euphoric days at the end of the 20th century. Second one is in the 20th century, a lot of the debate economically was capitalism was better than socialism, right? Got that, debate over. Most people agree, perhaps with the exception of Hugo Chavez and a few others like that. And there's a lot of talk that the reason that a China or an India or Brazil is successful economically is because they've become more capitalist. Well, there's some truth to that. But the really interesting questions in the 21st century are about the relationship between the state and the market. Because indeed, China's economic success is in part due to this strategic role that the state continues to play, guiding investment strategies and the like. Similarly in India, similarly in Brazil and many others. And so the balance between the state and the market and where that balance point is a big open question in the 21st century, not only which systems are going to succeed, but what are the models that other countries look to as they think about how to run their own efforts to achieve economic progress. And third, there were some others, but just to sort of get a sense of what I mean, again, 20th century debate, democracy was better than dictatorship. got that debate over, democracy won. But the 21st century debate is really kind of interesting. It's really fundamentally a question of can democracy deliver on poverty and other pressing human needs? What's often referred to as the Beijing consensus. That's showing some strains, but the fact is that model has pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and that there are many systems in the world in which legitimacy is based on performance, not just process. And the question about how you achieve capable and effective governance in the 21st century is more of an open question than we thought when we thought everybody was becoming democratic. That's not to say that it justifies a General Pinochet in Chile or repressive regimes elsewhere. But the way the legitimacy is defined in different political systems is about performance and not just the way we tend to define it here. So that was the first way I think that we thought that the War of Ideas got it wrong. Second way was, in fact, it wasn't a war. Metaphors really matter. This wasn't the domain of armies and generals. There were no shock and awe tactics. It was much more a competition within a marketplace of ideas in which the goal was to gain market share, if you will, that there were global publics picking and choosing what most attracts them. And we go into this in some depth in the book. I don't want to get into it too much here, but we sort of give you a sense in the second chapter about the way this marketplace works, the way that its global digital infrastructure works, the power of images, the way in which the world is increasingly interconnected, the way in which governments have less and less monopoly over information, and there are more and more sources, and the way in which the consumers, if you will, are increasingly young, urban, and non-Western. And that all of those qualities are very important. And while we might hope that they do, they don't have pictures of John Kennedy over their dining room tables anymore as much as in a different era. And so this is a marketplace of ideas, and thus this is our notion of the global competition of ideas. It's not something you win as a war, but indeed you need strategies that are more attuned to competitive marketplaces. Secondly, in terms of the broader strategic context, again, just a couple of quick points here. And here I have to give a debt to my days as an undergraduate at Cornell University in the late 60s, early 70s, when I had a then unknown professor of astronomy named Carl Sagan, who used to teach a course called Astronomy for Non-Majors that those of us that weren't in science took. And he went on to educate the rest of America and the world on the universe the way he educated us. So I like, astronomy metaphors. And the one here, I think, is the way in which this is a world that's truer to Copernicus's theory of the universe than Ptolemy's. Ptolemy during Greek times was the ancient philosopher who saw the Earth at the center and everything else revolving around it. Copernicus came along a number of centuries later and said, no, actually, we all have our own orbits, and there's something called the sun at the center that holds us together. I think the way we saw the world in the Cold War was in a very Ptolemaic view. The United States was at the center. Things revolved around us economically, diplomatically, technologically, politically, ideologically. But I think the world we have today is much more of a Copernican world, in which there are different countries and systems and views of the world that each have their own orbits, their own interests, their own answers to some fundamental questions. There's a larger question there for another discussion about what is going to be the sun that holds us together that doesn't, so we don't crash into each other. But I think that that's a very different view of the world than, frankly, we still tend to see it in somewhat of a unipolar way. And when you go out there and you see what the debates are in the world, it's not to say the United States doesn't still have some gravitational pull, if you will. But it's a very different world that's much more Copernican than Ptolemaic. And related to that is something that we take from Margaret Thatcher, who used to have this expression called TINA. There is no alternative to basically the Anglo-Saxon view of things and systems. Well, what we see in the world a lot today is that TINA is not enough, that the TINA argument is something you resort to sometimes when you don't have positive arguments. Say, well, I know it's not very good, but there is no alternative. Well, when you look around the world on a lot of these dimensions, we see themba. There must be an alternative. Not that there's some single packaged ism that's going to dominate the world, but that there is this competition of ideas about state and market, forms of governance, global rules, and the like. And the arrogance we refer to in the title We haven't said whether arrogance is over or it should end. Here we leave that to the view of the reader. Is this sense of not seeing these aspects of the world, that to the extent that we don't see those in much of our own political debate, this is not about hurting the feelings of others in the world, but it is about ways we handicap ourselves in our capacity to compete in this global marketplace of ideas. With arrogance comes a sense of entitlement and overconfidence that you will be successful and others will turn to you. And part of the fundamental argument of the book is that to the extent that we can end this arrogance, we can compete more effectively. We are not declinists. We can probably portrayed on various shows on certain unnamed television networks or radio shows as declinists, because we're not simply saying that, America still dominates, and if we do things as we always did, things will be good. But we actually argue in this book that the true declinists are the denialists. That to the extent that you deny that these changes are happening in the world, that is more likely to lead to problems for the United States in this global competitiveness. And that kind of debate distorts, distracts from the really tough issues that face us. If you think about it, for much of our history, we had 150-ish years where largely, throughout our history, we've gotten used to either sitting atop the world or apart from the world. For the first 150 plus years, while we were not as isolationist as often depicted, we were insulated by the oceans and blessed by a richly endowed land. We could selectively engage with the outside world, competing when and where we chose, well into the 20th century. Following World War II and in the context of the Cold War, again, it was very Ptolemaic. We were dominant by many measures. Today, though, the world is a highly competitive place. There are more players in the game. There are more arenas being contested. The global economy has more buyers and sellers than ever before. Scientific and technological advances are coming from labs and research in more and more parts of the world. Different political systems boast relative strengths of governance capacities. Distinct cultures emanate their own allures. The challenges of competitiveness are different, we argue, than any other era the United States has faced. And I think, and I'll come back to this at the end, this is part of our current political context. I think there's a lot of uncertainty and fear out there. We've never gone through a major recession before where the global marketplace economically was as competitive as it is today. And I think that this sense of this being a different era is kind of what we're getting to. So a lot of the book talks about what kind of strategy can be effective for this global competition of ideas. And here we really talk internationally and domestically. Internationally, we talk about how to be a leader in conceptions of world order. And domestically, we talk about how to be a leader in debates over the nature of what is a just society. Now, again, may sound philosophical, but coming back to my points at the beginning, it's really about how we frame, a lot of very specific issues in very practical ways. It's not just about public diplomacy. A lot of good work has been done on public diplomacy by a number of think tanks. The University of Southern California now has a whole school and program on this. But I think this digs a little deeper than just techniques of sort of marketing or getting the word out. It's not just about soft power, as my friend and colleague Joe Nye has talked about, which is persuasive. It's much more fundamentally getting at, what it is we stand for, as well as how we articulate this. And the approach we take is one we call adaptation rather than restoration. While grounded in some traditional American practices and values, it's about adapting to the nature of the 21st century world, not just asking what worked in the Cold War, or what did our founders think worked in the late 18th century. In terms of world order, we work with we argue for an approach that takes seriously the notion of mutuality. Now, this has been a key emphasis of the Obama administration. If you read the National Security Strategy, you'll see mutual or mutuality used about 30 times. And the argument is the sense that it's a world in which, while the United States, there's no problems the United States can solve on our own, yet there are very few problems the world can solve without a constructive U.S. role. But I think that actually mutuality remains more aspirational than actual. If you look around the world, I think the world came together reasonably well in the G20 in terms of the immediate financial crisis. But if you look in today's paper, you see the debates within the G20 over currencies and others are being about as contested as traditional IMF and WTO debates have been. And so the question remains, in a world of many countries pursuing their own national interests and with their sense of their own identities, we believe that the country that can genuinely convince others that it stands for a degree of mutuality, which is not altruism. No state is out there to be an altruistic actor. We leave that for the Gates Foundation or the Ford Foundation or others, although some might even dispute that. But it's about pursuing your interests in ways that maximize the effort to have shared and not just selfish interests. That to be true to this notion that none of us can solve our problems, as individual countries, we have to do it on our own. And frankly, I think we enter this debate with, in some ways, an advantage and in some ways a disadvantage. The disadvantage is that we often claim that we stand for mutuality. And when you make that claim, the gap between what you do and what you say in relative terms can hurt you, even if you're saying, well, we do this more than others, if others don't claim to do it as much. And so part of this is the sense of how you sort of close that gap or narrow that gap. And a couple of examples of ways in which we think this pertains on some particular policy issues is there are a number of issues that we refer to as unbalanced bargains that carry over from the previous era. One, for example, is on the unilateralist use of force. Now, we all know this, the statement that every president makes is we will use force multilaterally whenever possible, but we reserve the right to use it unilaterally. And that basic distinction can never fully go away, particularly when it comes to things that are in self-defense. You can never totally cede that right, but you have to get as minimalist as possible. Because when the United States makes claims like we did in the situation of Iraq in 2003, other countries of the world, Russia, will say, well, thank you very much. Georgia is that kind of issue for us in 2008. Or other countries will make the claims. But the unilateralist use of force is a way in which many countries in the world, take the view that the United States is not being consistent with principles of mutuality. And so we have to make an effort to narrow that claim as much as possible. And one can think of any number of issues which we can discuss in which that might come to bear. Secondly is pursuing genuine partnerships in our diplomacy. We do formulate, Secretary of State Clinton gave a speech over a year ago in which she talked about a multi-partner world. I actually think that's the right formulation. It comes back to this notion that there are very few problems you can solve on your own. And the kinds of partners you need are going to vary. There are going to be coalitions, there are going to be alliances, there are going to be international institutions, and the like. But I think there is still a sense in many parts of the world that we approach partnerships in too much of a senior partner, junior partner role. You're our partner, here's your talking points. This is one of the issues that swirled around the debates that we had with countries like Brazil and Turkey last spring over the Iran nuclear proliferation issue. And I think as we approach partnerships, we have to do it in a way that understands that other countries not only have interests at stake, but they have a lot of pride. And they have a lot of sense of identity, and there's a lot of genuine excitement and gratification of having finally gotten seats at the table. After many years of being seen as a third world country or a colony or a country that was dominated by others. And so in forging partnerships, we really, in our diplomacy, have to continue to work for ways that genuinely look to partner with countries in ways that may not always be our optimal outcome. Ultimately need to stay within certain red lines that you have about what your core interests are, but are more willing perhaps than we've been to have these be shared efforts to go out and solve world problems. Then there are other areas on the economic side, just as illustrations. The Doha trade round is tied up for any number of reasons, and there's a lot of fault to go around to many countries. But clearly, agricultural subsidies as practiced in this country, as practiced by the EU, and as practiced by Japan, are a major issue. We subsidize our farmers, and they tend to be big business farmers, in ways that make it harder for farmers in developing countries, where we say we want to promote development to get reasonable world prices for their cotton or for their sugar and their like. And I think another way of demonstrating mutuality would be to, come forward on some of these trade issues and be willing to really genuinely take on things like agricultural subsidies. Similarly, intellectual property and issues like AIDS drugs, we also go into here. All of these involve interest groups, obviously, and part of the answer is how do you get it done, and I'll come to that in a second. But part of this also is domestically walking the walk and not just talking the talk. When Copenhagen broke up in December on climate change, again, it was not just a U.S. issue. China and others were not particularly mutual in their positions. But it was not particularly credible to go to Copenhagen when we don't have much of a climate change policy or much of an energy security policy. Others can disagree with this, but we still are debating whether climate change is a problem, not what the solution can be. And much of the other world has moved on to that. So it's very hard to say we stand for climate change when we're not walking the walk at home. Similarly with financial stability. The 1997 Asian financial crisis was seen as emanating from Asia to other parts of the world, and then emanating from Russia the year after, and from Brazil the year after. The 2008 one emanated from the United States, and the country that had seen itself as the engine of global growth and prosperity was seen as a major source of the financial problems around the world. As we try to stabilize our system, the question of whether we're doing it in a way that genuinely creates sufficient stability domestically so that it doesn't hurt others again is also a big open question. This is kind of an opportunity, not just a challenge. When you look at the competitors out there, you take China, for example, and there are some things in the notion of the Beijing consensus that countries out there like, going lightly on human rights and making investments and the like. But China has its own problems. And in many ways, its pursuit of its own interests in the South China Sea, as just one recent example, is not exactly practicing mutuality. So the field in some ways is open for countries that can make the case that they stand for those positions more than others. All of these views, in my view, are things that are in our national interest. I think getting rid of agricultural subsidies would make us would help balance our budget, would help us at home. I think relaxing intellectual property rules on global aids is in our national interest, not just an act to help others. I think finding ways to genuine partnerships also is in our national interest as well. The last point, and I'll go through this quickly so we can have some time for discussion, in terms of the nature of a just society. In the interest of time, let me just pose a question. And that has to do with policy capacity and the state of the American model. In what policy areas today are we a model, a leader, exemplary? Healthcare? Green technology? High-speed rail? Public education? Infrastructure? National League of Cities released a report the other day that cities are in the worst fiscal shape in at least 25 years and have not bottomed out to the point where you see in the news sometimes fire departments that aren't responding to fires because of the budget cuts and what they consider to be their jurisdictions. We have to really think hard about the nature of our model in terms of what its policy capacity. And frankly, our politics too. I mean, what's the world to think of a country whose elections are permeated with calls for return to true Americanism, less than subtle signals from prominent media and political leaders for Second Amendment solutions, also known as gun violence against national leaders, and other toxic discourse and demagoguery against our own as well as so many others in the world? These are real issues in terms of how we project ourselves. It's a conception of the role of government. That much of the world sees the state as providing, as not being just protected against, but being part of their protection against the problems that they face. And it's fundamentally how we deal things with, like, the heterogeneity of our societies. It reminds me of during the Cold War when President Eisenhower deployed the National Guard to help integrate the schools of Little Rock, Arkansas. That one of the reasons he did that, if you look at the deliberations of the Eisenhower White House at the time, was a concern about the way that segregation played out in the ideological competition with the Soviet Union and the Third World. And an understanding in 1957, pre-YouTube, pre-internet, pre-Facebook, etc., very pre those, that what you did at home really affected the way you projected yourself globally. And our age, of this, vibrant marketplace of ideas and technology, what we do at home fundamentally affects the ways in which we can project the notion of what we view for ourselves as efforts to create a juster society in terms of how we project ourselves elsewhere. So the point of the book is to kind of put these issues out there in a broad context, relate them to some specific policy issues, and to relate them to some fundamental aspects of how we project ourselves in the world and our system. We believe that, it's actually an opportunity, that having a conception of mutuality that permeates more policies will help us pursue our national interests better, and also maximize our ability to compete in this global marketplace of ideas. And doing better about how we deal with our problems at home will also help us at home as well as we project ourselves around the world. Admitting those problems does require not being arrogant about saying that America is always number one. It's acknowledging that there are no entitlements. It's positive and constructive in the sense of saying we can be a world leader. But we have a lot of work ahead of us, and we really have to think about the context of the 21st century and deal with that rather than just going back to what may have worked in previous eras. So we've got some time for questions and discussion. Thank you very much, and look forward to any of your comments.
Thank you, Bruce. Let's open it up now for comments and questions. We'll start with John Maluski, the Wilson Center. There's a microphone there. It's coming around, and then we'll...
Thanks. Hi.
Is it on?
Testing 1, 2. Okay. Bruce, I want to follow up on your notion that metaphors matter.
Yeah.
When you rejected the military framing of a war and talked about sort of an economic framing, competition for a share of the world's marketplace of ideas, I was thinking of Ben Barber type theories on the difference between a consumer and a citizen, and wondering if you consider, is there a metaphor that's a civic metaphor? I agree that the military metaphor doesn't work, but I'm a little concerned about framing it in purely economic terms as well.
Yeah, that's a good question, John. I in some ways, I see the marketplace as civic as well. I mean, you think about, NGOs, for example, have their own, marketplace that they compete in about who has the best ideas and strategies for dealing with the problems that they work with. So I don't know. I have to think about that. But we didn't necessarily mean it, and in fact, part of the discussion we have about why we think it's not just about public diplomacy is sometimes that may be a little bit about, how you best sell, the toothpaste or the soap or something. It's not just about technique. And it is a view, and we go into this in some length, about the way these consumers work. I mean, people are very savvy. It's about images, not just words. People have a lot to choose from, and you're not going to convince them just by better kind of diversion of advertising. So we do mean it in a civic way, but your point's a good one. We'll sort of think that through a little bit.
This gentleman here, microphone. You can just pass it across, John. There you go.
My name is Jonathan. I'm a research assistant here at the Wilson Center. I was interested in your comment about the DOA rounds and specifically agricultural subsidies and how that's been a problem for the United States and EU for so long. And I was wondering if you had any specific comments on how to remedy that, because it seems that agricultural subsidies seem to, emanate from our domestic politics. And so I was wondering if there's anything outside of just strong political leadership that the U.S. can do to fix that in the context of achieving broader goals.
No, that's a good question. In fact, it goes back to that's not a part of some of the things I said. Obviously, it had some partisan implications, but this one's not partisan. It's really about what James Madison wrote about in the Federalist Papers, Federalist number 10. In which he talked about the danger to the system of what he called factions, and we now call interest groups, K Street, you name it, And if you go back and read Madison's Federalist 10, written well before, you wonder what Madison would think if he picked up Politico today and read Politico, and he talked about the way, and he believed at the time that the system would have enough checks that, the individual interests of different groups would be checked by the overall size of the country. So I think fundamentally it's one of the ways that people talk about the system being, very broken, and that, the power that interest groups have. There is, you look at you put it in the fiscal context. And so, we pay a lot of money out of the federal budget for the subsidies, number one. And then number two, we pay a fair amount of money out of the federal budget for foreign aid to countries like Mali, whose cotton prices are driven down by ours being held up by subsidies. So we're paying out of the federal budget a second time. And number three, we're probably paying out a fair amount, out of counterterrorism budgets for concerns about the way that, these kinds of economic problems can help create, safe havens for, So, I'm not a master communicator, but there's a national interest fiscal argument there at a time which we're paying a bit more attention to deficits. But I think ultimately it's going to take a capacity to see, that there's some interest at stake here, and it's very hard. And believe me, I've worked on the Hill. I know that I'm not naive about that. But in some ways, the role of sometimes when you're trying to put ideas out there, it's a definition of what's realistic. A lot of times people think university campuses aren't the real world. Well, having worked inside the Beltway for a fair number of years, I'm not sure this is the real world either, right? We're both unreal world. And what's realistic politically may be totally unrealistic in policy terms. And so we have a gap between the political logic and call it the policy logic. So some of us want to strongly articulate the policy logic and try to move the political logic, because we don't think that you can fix the policy logic by sticking within the confines of the political logic.
Mark Katz.
Mark Katz, George Mason University. Well, I like your metaphor of the global marketplace competition of ideas, but I'm just wondering if you could sort of sketch out, what precisely is the competition out there? In other words, is there who are we? In other words, who else is selling ideas in competition with us? Is there like a European idea? Is that they seem to think there is one? A Chinese idea. Now we know that in the past that there are some bad ideas, and I think that Marxism-Leninism was one. What was amazing, of course, is that it held sway in the marketplace for quite some period of time. And maybe you can sort of if you could sketch out what are there bad ideas out there holding sway, but are there some good ideas? Is there some actual competition for us? If you could tell us that, thanks.
Sure. No, that's a good question, Mark. One of the things we say is, and I think I mentioned this, it's not some packageism that's going to emerge, like Marxism-Leninism was. It is going to engage a number of questions, one of which I think is this relation between the state and the market. And there I think you see really interesting models and ideas out there about where these balance points are. And I think that, and it's not just the China model. You've got, the Singaporean approach, you've got the Brazilian approach, the Indian approach, and there we sort of describe it as it's not the Keynesianism, but it's sort of the strategic investment model of the state, which is different than what we debated in the 80s of industrial policy, which was you're a winner, you're a loser. How do you create an environment in which the business model changes so that some of the major innovative technologies of the 21st century, like green technologies, the economics change? This is what China's been doing, for example, right? So that's why solar panels and wind turbines are being produced there. This is what Portugal did, for example. A democratically elected, parliamentary system put in place over the last 5 years, and Denmark's another example, ways in which shifting the incentives, because there's nothing natural, as we all know, about oil being cheaper. It has to do with the structure of incentives. It has to do, frankly, with policy and not just the free market. So one sense is looking at sort of a whole range of different debates out there. What are the best models of governance at the domestic level? And here it's this notion of the source of legitimacy in a lot of societies is much more about performance than process. It really is. There was a poll in Latin America a few years back in which people were, when they were in a lot of economic downturn, and the question was, would you favor return to military government, if it would be better economically. And you got a small majority that said yes. I think if the military was about to take power, they'd have a different view. But it expressed a discontent, a sense of it was about performance. And so I think the question of legitimacy and the nature of good governance. So from our perspective, we do a lot of emphasis on democracy, promotion, and human rights. Well, frankly, if somebody turns to you now and says, so you want us to have a system that has free elections and they work like yours, that kind of discourse, and that kind of paralysis, to go back to the question I was asked before about policy capacity. We have a passage here at the end that I just want to read for a second that addresses a little bit. We say, no charismatic leader has yet emerged to powerfully articulate the message of a particular ism in a compelling way. There's no Lenin, no Jefferson, no Martin Luther King Jr. of this world, not yet. Indeed, the clumsiness of someone like Hugo Chavez makes it seem as if the emergence of such a leader were impossible. But it's not impossible. Can we imagine a young, technologically savvy, educated, rich, non-Western leader combining elements of Lee Kuan Yew, Vladimir Putin, Nelson Mandela, Carlos Slim, and Muhammad Yunus? Do we know what we would say to that person, or more important, to the over 4 billion people who might be listening to her? It's an interesting exercise, to think about. And I think the answer is just because it's not there, we don't know what's coming. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm the ambassador of Syria. Actually, in your last statement, you have partially addressed my question, but yet I will put it forth nonetheless. Am I right or wrong in presuming, being a foreigner observing what's happening here in this country and reporting back to my government, that in the past, in the second half of the 20th century, what you call the global marketplace for ideas competing against each other, there was more or less a consensus here in the United States about the major ideas. And this is, in a way or another, a factor that helped you get a perception that you did win that war. While today, when we look at the domestic scene here in the United States, you cannot talk of a sort of a consensus about the major ideas that are right now being in the competition marketplace.
No, absolutely. And let me take this occasion to thank my friend Ambassador Mustafa, who I guess about a year and a half ago, it was January of 2009, set up a trip for myself and people from the Stimson Center and the U.S. Institute of Peace to his country, including meetings with President Assad and others, which were very informative and helpful at the time. There is no consensus in this country. We also talk in the book about what we call the need for a shared sense of purpose. And one, does see this to a certain extent in certain countries. There's a lot of interesting debate what's going on in China now. And believe me, the Nobel Prize winner, human rights activist in jail, is not feeling a shared sense of purpose with his government, nor others. But in terms of, what the dynamic is there, and the nature of the debates, what's driven that country ahead has been, some of it is imposed and enforced by all means, but some sense of ways in which the system is working along with the ways that it's not working. You go to Brazil and you have an outgoing president who's leaving with 80% approval ratings. Pretty unbelievable. Most world leaders would, like to have, maybe even half to 2/3 of that. And you see also a lot of issues, environmental issues, issues of poverty. I think that what we need, to a great extent, is a greater shared sense of purpose in this country. And I think that the debates, and it's not so much that we'll all ever think alike, and even in the Cold War, we exaggerate the ways we thought alike. Consensus was a flexible consensus. The problem was actually more, I think, at the end of the Cold War, where there was this sense of triumphalism. That was the end of history. That was the democratic peace. That was globalization as Americanization. And I think that dominated in a bipartisan way, frankly, in the 90s. And part of what we're arguing for is a greater shared sense of purpose that comes out of what I said earlier, of understanding that we live in a more competitive age than we ever have historically, that to succeed, and succeed doesn't mean dominating, but it means playing a global role that we think is good for us and good for the world, and achieving our own national objectives, really requires us, to do what we need to do to be more competitive, and frankly, to not, lose ourselves in some of the. I mean, I'm greatly concerned about the kind of debates we have that, frankly, are going backwards rather than forwards. It's a little bit like if you're an Olympic athlete, right? Or if you're a very good athlete, and you're very good and you get used to being able to compete without having to go by strict training rules because you're just that good and your other competitors aren't that good. Well, when the competition steps up, if you don't train effectively, you're not going to be as effective. And we may have gotten used to the ability when we were in a more dominant position to compete effectively even when we weren't at the top of our game, if you will. I think we really need to be at the top of our game in order to compete effectively, again, in ways that I think are important to our own interests as well as to a constructive role to play in the world.
Bruce, let me just make a comment that you can react to in the famous, make a comment. My question is, what do you think of it? Looking at your book in context, it seems, that you're kind of operating within this, what one political scientist calls the liberal hegemony of international relations. I mean, basically, the structure you're operating within is sort of a global kind of framework, and there are changes occurring in it. And that's in a context where, the pendulum has swung after 9/11. There was a sort of end of Cold War, there's sort of out towards triumphalism and that. And we're kind of, the pendulum is coming back. And we've seen this goes through, there's a periodicity. You mentioned your graduate work at Cornell around in the mid-'70s. I recall a book by Dick Rosecrans called America's an Ordinary Country. I mean, we've seen this, Huntington wrote an article about waves of decline. After Sputnik, there was this big declinist thing, and so the first sort of is this really qualitatively different than kind of just the normal kind of pendular kind of shifts there, and then second, just going back to my starting point, if the framework you're operating within is sort of this John Eikenberry, liberal international order. And we've got rising powers, and the U.S. grand strategy has been integration. How do we bring them into the international order? But as you point out, as they're contesting the terms of integration and how rules are set and interpreted, and we've seen, as I guess there was a piece in the FT where saying these rising powers are basically asserting just sort of nationalist sort of interests. They're not really kind of, and so what's getting lost is this sense of any kind of global public good. And, and it's not altruism. The United States has played a role in providing kind of global public goods, but we're going to be less willing to do it and less wanting to pay for it. So what does that kind of world look like? If it's going to be a liberal order, who's going to provide the global public good? Right.
No, it's a good question. That's the question of what is the equivalent of the sun at the center of this Copernican world. I'd say a couple points. We actually are not. We really do challenge John Eikenberry's liberal hegemony. I mean, the whole notion of the big questions reopen: who makes the rules? What's the relation between the state and market? What's the operative forms of government? Are very different questions, and then I think John's is much more integration. We think the big questions are really reopened even more than John does. Second is what's different about this, I think, is what I was saying about the global context. Okay, so all of these other, the Dick wrote, the America's an Ordinary Country after Vietnam in the 70s was in the context still of a world that was largely defined, as we saw it, by the U.S.-Soviet relationship, and the Soviets were going into decline. So you could still be an athlete that wasn't at the top of your game. But the sense of the global, the competitiveness of this era from so many different directions, I think is different than any other period in history. So I'm always leery about our era is different. No, I think it's a fundamental shift. And your last question about who provides the global public goods is exactly what we're saying. There's not a clear answer to that. I do this with my students in my classes on globalization. Tell me what a global public. It's the difference between the ought and the is. And this is what I meant between mutualities being more aspirational than actual. That is a real challenge. And other countries, too, I think, at Copenhagen had a definition of national interest that did not lead to a definition of mutuality. But part of the reason we argue that to the extent that you can have credibility and mutuality, because while the U.S. has provided a lot of global public goods in other areas, freedom of the sea, it's done it in ways that have had a lot of unbalanced bargains. And the net of that, I think, is open to serious debate. So that's where the challenge is. To the extent that you can really affirm that, I think ultimately it will give you some leverage they can use in other spheres of international affairs as well.
Thanks so much, Bruce. I'm afraid we have to leave it there so we can sign a few books and then catch this plane to Chicago. But the book, End of Arrogance, available for purchase outside. Please join me in thanking Bruce Jonathan for an excellent presentation.
A little longer than I wanted, but